Okay. Hi.
Hi.
So I'm just going to invite us to start as we always do. I'm going to invite Natalie and myself to start to look around the room. And those of you who are listening today, if you are able to stop what you're doing and look around and let your eyes sort of guide you around the room. If you're doing an activity where you can't do that, just start to take some nice deep breaths with us. We're starting with the exercise we always start with, which is somatic experiencing exercise called orientating. And we're just doing this to take in our surrounding and become really present with where we are, what we're doing. And as your eyes get curious about your surroundings, just notice what starts to happen to your breath, what happens with your body. If you feel an organic inclination for the breath to deepen, follow that body impulse. And as your eyes are wandering, just notice if there's anything that your eyes become really attracted to. And as you let your eyes land on whatever is most curious for them, just take in the qualities of that thing that you are now gazing at. And again, just notice what happens in your body and with your breath as you're taking in the qualities of whatever you're looking at. Again, allowing your body to move you if you need to, following that body impulse. So doing this exercise allows our nervous system to start to come into regulation. Now I'm going to invite you to close your eyes so we can connect a little deeper into ourselves and where we're at. Feeling your feet on the earth, feeling your seat. If you're standing, feeling your spine supporting you. If you're sitting in a chair and the chair is supporting you, feel that support of the chair. And starting to now take some nice deep breaths if you haven't already. And if you feel like you need to release some energy because things are a little bit overwhelming or you have some anxiety in your life right now, feel free to do a nice cleansing breath through the mouth. And if you feel like you need to retain that energy and sort of keep that vitality really close to you, you can just inhale and exhale through the nose. And as you're breathing, again, just notice how you're feeling in this moment without attaching any story, just from a point of curiosity. And in doing this, we just allow ourselves to become aware of how we need to proceed to the next day or week, or in this next hour or two with this conversation we're about to have. So take a couple more deep breaths. And allow your eyes to now slowly to open. There we go. I always feel so much better after I do that.
Yes.
Nervousness or anticipation is like, okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. One, because you have been a mentor of mine for so many years in so many ways, mostly around yoga, but in a lot of different ways. And we've also been colleagues and coworkers and friends and lived in the same town. So I'm really excited to have you on the podcast today and excited to talk to you a little bit about what you're up to now and how your life has sort of led you to this point. And today I'd like to especially talk about your 13 moon sadhana for women, which I'm really excited about diving into with you. And also just a little bit about your own personal story of how yoga has helped you. So I'd like to maybe start with a little bit of of that, just like how yoga has been this sort of constant thing in your life, and how that has really helped you through all the challenges and triumphs that you've experienced.
Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, yoga has been part of my life. I want to say, when was I first introduced to yoga? I was given a book about yoga when I was pregnant with my son, which would have been 1997. But I couldn't figure it out from a book. And so even though my friend said that this book was so helpful to her during her pregnancy, I remember looking at the pictures and just sort of putting it aside, and it just was there. So I had an idea of what yoga was, but I'd never experienced it in my body. I'd never been taught it. And soon after I had my son, a lot came up in my life, a lot of unresolved grief and just sort of unfinished storylines that needed to be dealt with. I think that parenting does that. It makes it very obvious where you're incomplete and where work needs to be done, especially as I had my son when I was 22. So I was, at that time in my life where there was certain healing work that needed to be done that hadn't. I think I thought I could just sort of bypass it and move on to like happily ever after, marry, get a kid, have a child, do all that. And it didn't really work like that, which I'm grateful for, that, something kind of woke up in me and let me know, okay, in order to be the parent you want to be and the person you want to be, you have to do some work. And so in that first year and a half after having my son, a lot was coming up, and I was in a lot of turmoil and a lot of challenge in all of my relationships with myself and with my son's father. And somehow I ended up at a yoga class on Chesterman's Beach in Tofino, the town where we lived together. And it really was for me like a love at first sight type of thing, first experience. Like the first class I ever went to was a profound experience. And I just remember going in there so full of pain and suffering, and really feeling that was all I could see in the world, and all I could experience was just that it was very limiting. My experience of suffering was limiting me from any sense of perspective at all. And I remember going through the class and having a number of different experiences. One was just this sort of somatic experience of that all of these emotions were living in my body in some way, and not just the difficult ones, but joyful ones too. I distinctly remember doing something, I think we were in some forward bending pose, and just laughter coming out of me. It was just such an incredible experience to experience my body in that way, and emotions in that way, and my mind in that way, because I did get this sense by the time we came to the end of the class that my view had broadened, and I had my suffering in a different perspective. So it was really profound. And yet it wasn't easy to access yoga living in a small town. The town that we lived in, of course, was really small. I mean, then it was probably about 1,200 people living there full time, and there wasn't regular yoga classes to get to. And I was a busy working mom at the time, so I couldn't always get to the few classes that were scheduled. But I just sort of had it on my radar, and I just kept looking for it. And eventually that led me to study it very seriously. But since that time, since about, I'm going to say around 1999, I got more serious, early 2000. Since that time, yoga has been a primary tool, and certainly not the only tool that I use for healing, but it has been a major, major tool that has been a part of my everyday life and daily practice. And it's helped me with all those things that I mentioned, primarily to get perspective, to be able to have a different experience of my physical being, of my emotional being, of my mental experience. So I just find the meditative tools of yoga to be very powerful. And as well as, I do the physical practice, obviously, but the physical practice has always been a meditative tool for me, as well as a sensual tool, because it is very powerful to just get into the experience of your body in a way that is just you and your experience.
Yeah, I really agree with that. And I think when we go through trauma or challenging situations, especially around our body, we tend to disassociate from it. And that, for me, yoga has hands down been the most powerful tool for me to get back into my body and experience what you said, like those emotions that are trapped in there. And for me, it's been a constant tool since I found it too, in the early 2000s as well. Is there, I can imagine being a 22-year-old and having a child at that time, and you know, being a mother who's working is in itself challenging. But you said that, you know, even before that, you had a lot of, you know, you recognize that you had some emotions and some suffering that was needing to be undone, and having your son sort of brought that to life.
Yeah.
Can you touch a little more deeply on that? Maybe it was from your upbringing or your teenage year.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it was really like all of my life up until that point. It was really a cycle of suffering and really a perpetuating of abuse that occurred when in my childhood. Things were pretty wild in my home. My parents were not really well when they came together, spiritually or mentally, and of course they, you know, I was born in the mid 70s, so they were meeting at that very potent time in history, and I think they came to the relationship with a lot of personal pain and had no other way to manage it except for self-medicating, so using lots of substances. So addiction is a major thread in my family, quite serious addiction. So that imprinted my childhood experience. There was, again, the addiction on both sides. With my mother and my father was a way of managing their own pain and suffering, but it doesn't work so well. So there was a lot of volatility, a lot of intensity emotionally. And even when they split apart, that didn't change, because of course then we went, you know, from home to home, and my mother went through successive relationships, but it was very much a pattern to be with other people who were suffering, and again, this constant thread of addiction and substance abuse. And so even when I left that environment, which I did quite young, I left home when I was 15. I just had to get away. And except that what I did was I just perpetuated that environment that I was familiar with. Yeah. So even though I left that environment to try and have control over my environment for myself, it was what was known and familiar. And so I just recreated that in the friends that I chose and the situations that I put myself in. So there was a long history of me for myself with that, like you said, disassociating from my experience mentally, emotionally, and physically. I started, really trying to control my experience with my body, probably by the time I was about 12 or 13, with some pretty serious eating disorders, which I'm really fortunate that I was able to work through by the time I got to my early 20s. But it was pretty serious in my early teens. And then, of course, experimenting with drugs and alcohol, and often getting myself, again, in sexual situations that were not really very respectful of myself, but I didn't have a good sense of my boundaries because I'd experienced childhood sexual abuse. So all of that, it's really just like a combination of all of those things, so that by the time I was pregnant with my son, I was in a healthy and loving relationship with a man who was sober, except that I didn't have a lot of that stuff dealt with. And so I really feel that the birth of my son was the impetus to finish up, or, the healing work that I had started. And really my healing journey started prior to me finding yoga, and it started with food. Yeah. With learning how to heal my eating disorders, because I've always had a love for food and for cooking and for nourishment that comes through being fed and feeding others. And so I started studying macrobiotics when I was about 18, and that led me to studying things like Ayurveda and just whole food eating. And that was huge. That really created the foundation of wellness. And then I added yoga onto it, and then that led me to other tools. So, kind of like that.
Yeah, thanks for sharing all of that, because I think, one of the things I know in the trauma world that's changing quite rapidly right now and in a profound way is that the complex trauma is huge, and it's more likely that someone's going to have a complex trauma background, including maybe one particular event that was really catastrophic for them. And that, you know, we're bringing a lot into this place, especially, you know, when you have that, for you, it was your son being born, but when you have that moment of like, okay, I need to change this, we do really need to come at all different angles. And nutrition, I think, is a huge one, because that's also another way of relating to your body, you know, taking the external environment into our body. And we talk a lot about that in our programs, and nutrition's a big focus on that. And I know for you too, even with your yoga teachings, especially now, you really weave in that nutrition part and just sort of like plant those seeds for people. So I think, you know, that's a really great point and foundation, because we need to eat every day, and that in itself can become a practice.
Yeah, I mean, I'm continually being reminded. I mean, I'm always working with, you know, maintaining balance. And sometimes you get into these bad habits where I'll just be so fixated. Like now I work at a desk more than I ever have before. And sometimes that means, you know, you're in your head a lot. It becomes very cerebral, and it's harder to get up a true appetite. So sometimes I'll go too long in the day without really stopping to eat properly, and then just observing how much more exaggerated my emotions become. And so it's all so connected, right? It's so important. And I agree that in order to have true health or to heal, especially when there's been complex trauma, you do need to have a lot of different healing modalities that you're pulling from. It's not one thing. There's not one thing that's going to do it all.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
But that's fun to me, actually. I love that. I love this idea of like a basket of tools, you know?
Yeah. I call it like I think it was 2.5 years ago, I was like, okay, things have got to change. And I've always kind of been on my healing journey, but I was like, things have got to change in a huge way. And I assembled this army of my healing providers and like the people I looked up to and all that.
Yeah.
And you know, I had the stuff
that.
Yeah. And so it is fun. It's exciting to exist in that way. So can you touch a little bit more? Because I think it's a huge thing that happens quite a bit, is when, I mean, I haven't had, the blessing of having a child yet. But I know for a lot of people that having a child, and from what I've witnessed and talked to with others, having a child can really be that, like, okay, I got to clean up my act here. And it can also be to sort of bypass my stuff, because now I just have to be a parent. And it seems like for you, I'm not saying that maybe there wasn't any bypassing at all. It's kind of in our nature to avoid uncomfortable things. And sometimes as a parent, you do just have to show up as a parent. But you had mentioned that was definitely a huge point for you to really step into healing. And I'm wondering if you could elaborate on that a little bit more.
Yeah, it's such a play there, because I think it's probably really common, especially in younger parents, when you have your children, that you're confronted with the growing up that you still need to do, but then the necessity of being the adult for your child, right? And that was very, very difficult. And there was a lot of suffering that came up around that, because it was on a gut level, on a heart level, I understood that I needed to do some deep inner work. And yet, what an inconvenient time to want to suddenly, or need to suddenly, like, because that's what it felt like. It wasn't like want to, it was like, I need to, my survival depends on this. I really felt that if I wanted to create a new story for my lineage, for my son, that I needed to do this work. And I couldn't always articulate that clearly to other people. I just knew it was necessary, but that was hard for other people on the outside to understand, because because what it led me to do was to essentially break up my marriage with my son's father, who again is an amazing man, an amazing father. And we had our own home, and we, you know, from outside, everything was perfect, but I knew that I wasn't going to be able to do that work in that relationship. So it meant breaking up a stable relationship. And that's never a good thing with a young child. Right. And then basically to allow myself to go through the process of having really like a breakdown, which I think is a big part of healing, is the healing crisis. So to allow myself to do that, even though that is totally inconvenient with a young child, and then to go and pursue the study of something that I considered medicine, which was yoga at that time. And to do that, even though everyone in my life was telling me that it was a bad idea. So all of that was very difficult. It was very difficult to still keep like trusting myself, because there was something in me that said, do this work, don't stop, don't doubt it, keep going, because it was hard. It was hard to go through a divorce. It was the instability that came with that, and the extra challenge and the work. And I did a lot of crying for like a year and a half. I just felt like I cried all the time. And people who knew me said you made this choice because you said you wanted to be happy, but you don't look happy. And I remember crying and saying, I'm going to be happy. I'm going to be happy. Yeah. So something in me knew that I am going to be happy. And I knew happiness was on the other side of a lot of pain. But so I just stuck with it. And, years later, I had many people in my life say to me, like, God, I was so angry at you at that time when you did that. And I didn't understand what you were doing, or I thought it was selfish. Like, I've had so many people say some version of that to me, and then say, but now I see what you did and how much you transformed your life. And I have a lot of respect for you. But at the time, I really didn't think you knew what you were doing. Yeah. and that's it. Like, and I couldn't articulate it. There was something in me that knew it needed to be done, but I couldn't see the finish line. I couldn't see what was on the other side. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I really believe it was having my son that sped that up. Would it have happened in my life anyway at some point? Probably, because I think I'm that kind of a person, mm-hmm. right? But definitely having Nova, my son, just made me, it just lit the fire a little more. The stakes were higher, I guess, because me being a mess, it was not just like my life that was being impacted. It was this child's life that was being impacted.
Yeah. And I'd love to talk a little bit more about too, just how you're saying, because I think that is something that I know has held me back in the past, but also driven me forward, is that you have to do something, but it seems completely irrational, or not just like there's no logic to it at all, but that it's a part of your healing journey. Yeah. And I think when it comes to trauma, especially complex trauma, there's so many little pieces that are needing to be uncovered. And I feel like that piece in general holds people back so much, because their friends are like, I remember when I first started studying yoga, a lot of my friends were like, Kelsey, like, don't yoga me. Like, I don't like that stuff's like not real or whatever, because it wasn't as early as you, but it was still earlier before this huge thing happened, that I'm just curious about like, I know your son gave you motivation, but I think, or I guess maybe if there's like advice or just something that we could say, or that you could say to that part about like, really following that. And like, there's going to be, I find too, that in healing big things like sexual abuse, like eating disorders, like addiction, all of those things, that there isn't a happy, feel good path through it all. And so the choices you need to make to really start that healing journey, again, like you said, are just like, they might seem absolutely crazy, but you're being guided to do that. Yeah. So for just sort of speaking to like any of those women right now who are listening to this podcast, of like, encouraging them in some way, or just sort of how you stayed connected to that, and why you stayed connected to that feeling of that's what you needed to do.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is just trusting in that inner voice, which might be very quiet at first, mm-hmm. especially, for myself, and I think any women listening who have had long periods of pain and suffering, and maybe, and for me, a big part of my healing was dealing with the shame as well, that came from being part of actually recreating abusive situations, like that I allowed myself. Mm-hmm. It's one thing when you're a child and you're abused and you don't have control because you're a small child and it's an adult, but it's to later in life participate in a way. Mm-hmm. A lot of, and then the associated bad choices that you make, there's a lot of shame around that. So I feel like shame is it's a very difficult one. Mm-hmm. And what it does is it can make us not trust ourselves. Mm-hmm. But if you can just find even like the faintest whisper of that voice in you that is saying to you, this is not a way to live, and get up and make the change. And you can trust in that, that's what will carry you through. And I think that's going to show up very differently for every person, whether that seems like it's their heart, or it seems like it's the voice of an inner guide or mentor, or some sort of spiritual guide that they feel they're in relationship with. For me, it's like the best way I can think of it is there's a sense of I know there's a thread in my life that feels almost like magical and true. And I know when I've got connection to it, and I know when I've lost it. And those big moments in my life where I've made really dramatic change for the positive is because I've just grabbed hold of that like little magic thread and trusted it. Even though absolutely none of it was rational, and I couldn't explain it to someone else. And sometimes that's the best thing too, is don't waste your energy trying to explain it to somebody else, because that can just be, it just drains you, really. It really just drains you. And I would say instead do the practices that help you to deepen your connection to that current of conviction or faith or truth. And that's a big part of it. I think it's just this faith in yourself, your higher purpose, your wholeness, even if you can't imagine it. And that's the difficult thing, is because you often have to go through a kind of shadow space. You can't picture the final destination. I know for myself, there was no way I could imagine the life that I have now, because I had absolutely no reference point for it. There was no example of it within my close family of what it looked like to have a very healthy and whole and happy and integrated life. It wasn't in my community of friends that I chose to surround myself with earlier in my life. Like it was just something I couldn't comprehend. So to be able to have faith that you're going on a journey to a destination you can't even imagine, right? You're going to have something to hold to. And it might just be very, very faint, but do whatever you can to kind of nourish that little flame or hold to that little thread.
Yeah. Thanks for saying that. I think that's another important piece of, like, we can fantasize and imagine what we would maybe want our life to look like, but when we don't have that reference point, there's no way we even can imagine really what it would be like. We just know that it is our birthright to live the life, that is fulfilling and, in all ways, and that we're appreciated and adored. And, we're meant to have that life in some way, shape, or form. And that's
it. It's just so hard to imagine, especially if you've never experienced that. And I know for myself, I don't have it anymore, but for even deep into my healing journey, when I had made a lot of major shifts, I still was oppressed in a way by an overriding feeling that something bad was going to happen any second. That I was, and I would have these crazy thoughts like, everything's going so well, the next thing that happens is going to be bad is definitely going to be really bad. Like it was just this horrible feeling of doom just around the corner. It's really hard, if someone has never really experienced that love or joy or even just stability in their lives to imagine it. So just keep feeding it. It seems like a total fantasy.
Yeah. I can so relate to that. Like, I know when I'm being challenged in my life, whether it's through my business or through a relationship or something where we're sort of working through another layer, I do have that sort of default thing too, that like, this is just all going to go to crap. Like it's done. Like if something terrible is going to happen, I just know it. Like when I'm in my insecure place and really vulnerable, that sort of like, it's almost like I want to prepare myself for it so that I'm not like surprised by it. And I wouldn't be surprised by it because, life ends up that way anyways, that story that
I know.
Yeah. How do you just because I've had the pleasure of like watching you raise your son, and your son is an amazing young man now. How was it for you? Because I know a lot of our listeners do have children. How was it for you to, be in your process and raise your child and show up for him? Like, what were your commitments to yourself, and how did that, how were you able to get through that with raising a child? Because I know a lot of people have a lot of fear around showing their children anything that they've been through or connecting with them in that way on any level. And a lot of fear of like, well, if I come from a messed up place, then my kid's going to be messed up. And
I
so
know.
how was it for you raising a son he's turned out to be I haven't seen him in many years, but he seems like he's amazing, and you guys have a really
He's an awesome guy for sure. He's really amazing. And part of that is that it's a team effort, right? I didn't do it all on my own. And on that, I agree. A lot of the time we think we need to there's certain things our children don't need to witness and see and hear all the gory details of. But it's also, we have to remember how sensitive children are, and they feel everything that's going on within a household, all that's not being spoken about. So depending on their age and what is appropriate, letting them know to some degree what's going on, I think is important, so that they're not just dealing with this unnamed fear and anxiety about what they sense is going on in their parents' lives, because we're all in process, right? Like, yeah. Everyone who's parenting is also still parenting themselves and growing up and learning. And ideally, we also, again, have a team to help us a bit. And I was very fortunate in that my son's father is, as I said a number of times, like just an amazing guy. And he's an important, even though we separated when my son was young, we've been very close all throughout his upbringing. We're still very, very close. I consider him like my brother. He's a very important part of my family, which is really my husband, who I've been with for 13 years now, and my son, and then my son's father and his family. This is what I think of as my immediate core family. And in the couple of years where I did my most intense healing work, he really stepped up as a parent, and he was pretty much the full-time parent during that. So my son was living primarily with his father for a couple of years while I was actually living in Vancouver. So I wasn't even living in the same town. And though I would see my son at every single opportunity that I could, I wasn't with him full time for a couple of years there when he was quite young. So that was a very difficult decision for me to make. But the reality was that I didn't have access to the resources I needed living in a small community. As you know, you've lived in that small community. It's a wonderful, beautiful place, but it didn't have the resources I needed for my healing and my studies and my growth. And so I went and committed myself to schooling and learning and healing kind of all at the same time. It was like a crash course, like tons of therapy, tons of personal work, tons of training. And then I came back to that small community and then was able to continue like that. So without his father helping me so much, that would have been impossible. I don't know how I would have done it. Again, I would have found a way to do it. It just would have been maybe a bit messier.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. And so by the time I was living full-time with my son again, a lot of the messiest work of my healing crisis was behind me. And so that was great. And then we could do the work of kind of repairing that, because again, it's always very difficult for children to experience families that have been broken apart. It has an effect on children. And I think it's especially so when they're young, when they can't really understand what's going on. And I split with my son's father when he was just a year and a half old. So he felt all that was going on, but he didn't understand it. And so the next few years were really focused on just helping him to feel very secure in himself and his relationship to his mother and his father, and know that our relationship as co-parents was solid, and it has continued to be so. So that was sort of the focus. And then, of course, I met my husband, who I'm married to now, and that added another level of support. So really, I feel like we've had like a parenting team, and my son's father has had significant relationships over the years, and those women have been part of the parenting team. And so all of that has given me more space than I think a lot of parents have. If you are a single parent on your own, completely on your own, without family support and without the other co-parent, and you're in the midst of deep healing work, that is very, very hard. And I was there for a couple years, and that was the hardest part. That was without a doubt the hardest part, because there would be times when I would basically put my son, down to bed, and then I would just be in the kitchen, just like crying uncontrollably and feeling like I didn't know if I could stop crying. And that's a scary feeling. It's scary to be doing that type of deep work. And it's not even at that point, you're just like unraveling, which is part of the healing journey. And yet knowing that you needed to try to hold it together for your kid. So, I mean, the only advice I have is to ask for help. Basically, you know, ask for help, get a team, and do what you need to do, because I knew that I needed to go through it in order to really put it behind me. I knew that if I didn't cry those tears then, I would always be crying them in a way. You know, I needed to get the work done. So I stuck it out. I persevered, but I have been really, really fortunate in that I've had help at really key times.
Yeah. I think, you know, your situation was unique to you for sure. And I do think that it's important, that piece of like reaching out for help and support, because there are so many resources out there now that even we can feel really isolated when maybe our family isn't supportive and we feel really alone because they're, you know, quote unquote, supposed to be there for us. But there is so many other resources, and sometimes our immediate family isn't the best resource, no matter how much we want it to be. And I think, you know, that is like, reach out for help, assemble your team, you know, find those resources that can help you so that you can be supported. And I just actually want to speak to the courage that it must have taken you to go and be away for your son for that couple of years and go do work. That must have been, I imagine, a very hard decision to make. And I think,
really hard.
Yeah, I think that speaks to a lot of courage that you have within you, and self-responsibility, that you knew that maybe even you didn't necessarily maybe want your son to witness all those things that you needed to go through, which could in fact have been even more damaging in some ways for him. So that's really, you know, beautiful. Our friends down in Mexico, we just met one of their foster kids, and the mom did the same thing. She's like, she went and found a foster family that she went through the system, but was very much a part of this. I need my son to be somewhere else. He's 1.5, so that she could go and do some work too. And I mean, hearing that, when I met the little boy, he's amazing. He's, you know, he's great. But that is something that, you know, the system is set up for too, that, you know, you can get that support that you really need.
Yeah. Yeah. And I, you know, I'm amazed by stories like that. And I do think it's so powerful, and does represent actually a huge amount of self-responsibility when a parent says, like, you know, I need to go do some recovery work, essentially. And if I ever want to have a functioning role in this child's life, you know, a functional role, a supportive role, I need to go do this work. And yet there's so much shame around it, because you will get told by culture, by people in your life, that you need to be there. But I question that, because having been parented by someone who really would have benefited from taking some time to do some healing work, sometimes it's better that your child is somewhere else where they can be cared for, so that the work can be done. And that's it. If you just do it and do the work, then you can repair that relationship. And we definitely had to do that. You know, the three of us, my son's father and my son and I, there's a bond there between the three of us that's always there, whether his father and I are in an intimate relationship. And we had to do the reparations afterwards, you know, after the split, and after we'd done our own personal work on ourselves. And I feel good that that's been done, because I can see it in my son, his sense of confidence in himself, and his sense of place in the world, and knowing that he's loved by both his parents, and that they have a healthy relationship. It's totally possible. That we just each have to do our own work.
Yeah. I think, you know, I've always admired that about you, that it, like, you are an example that is possible. You know,
it is possible.
Your family is definitely a reflection of that. So again, thank you so much for sharing so openly and vulnerably about your life. It's great. And I think part of the reason why we do this podcast is just that, so other women can hear stories of other women and realize that their own unique journey, however that may be, is possible. And we just kind of have to design what it looks like. And so do you, I know that, you know, your work, you were a practitioner of yoga, and now you're trained in it, and you're doing all this new work, and you're sort of adding in all these pieces. And in the last few years, you've started sort of directing some of that work to be specifically for women. Mm-hmm. What was your inspiration around that? What kind of guided you to start working with more women?
I mean, part of it, I think, was just a recognition that I'm always working with women anyway. Yeah. I mean, I think anyone else who's listening to this, who's also works in, healing modalities or teaches yoga, will relate to that often you are working with a group of people that is predominantly women. And I just want to say and acknowledge that I have worked with many, many incredible and amazing men. I have many male colleagues that I respect as yoga teachers. I've gotten to train many amazing male yoga teachers. It's just that it is primarily women. Mm-hmm. So I think it was just a recognition of that whenever I was creating programs or courses, that the people that were most drawn to my work were women. And that makes sense, I think, because of the way and the style that I teach. I think it is more attractive to women a lot of the time. Also, because I do weave a lot in, even now when people ask me, what do you do? Saying I'm a yoga teacher, I'm like, that doesn't really explain it anymore. And yoga is one thing that I teach, but I do so much more. But I've always woven other things into it. And so in a lot of the programs where I'm, weaving Ayurveda and lifestyle practice and personal ritual and yoga and all this stuff together, there was just so much that I wanted to speak to that I think is relevant really only to women. Mm-hmm. And I can speak to those things only because I am a woman. And so I know that I don't, and I think it's great. I think men should teach programs just for men, because there's things that are relevant to being a man that I have no understanding of at all. Right. And so I can, it just is the way it is. I can speak to it, and I have a lived experience of it. So as soon as I started doing that, just really stating, okay, wait, I really work with women. I like to work with women. I would like to create content that is specifically for women and speaks to what it is to be a woman living in the modern world, and then using all of these traditional tools in a way to support women's health. As soon as I committed to that, I just felt really right. So yeah, more and more of the stuff I'm doing is specifically for women.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mentioned earlier about the 13 moon sadhana, which it'll be once a year, right? Because it's a full year cycle of the moons. Yeah. And it starts in March. Yeah. And, but I'd love for you to just share a little bit more about that. At the time that we're recording this podcast, you're doing the first year of it, and I'm in the group, and I'm really excited. And there's something that I've always loved about, I think it was 4 years ago. No, it was 5 years ago now that I really got in tune with the moon and its cycle, and how it really, it affects all of us, men and women, but for women especially, because of our own cycle, no matter where we are in our lives with that, really has a really beautiful connection there. So I'd love for you to share a little bit about that program.
Yeah, I'm excited about this program too, and it's going to be unfolding as I do it. But basically, I've always been fascinated by seasonal wisdom teachings and the teachings on cycles. So before I ever came to yoga, as I said, my first real introduction into the healing realm was through food and nutrition. But I also was like a young witch, you could say. I was very, very interested in what is often called like pagan religions, just like Celtic traditions and nature magic. And before I ever had my son, before I ever found yoga, I spent a number of years living off the grid. So without running water, without electricity. And that was such a profound experience for me. I've always been a person who loves to live in small communities and as close to the wildness of nature as possible. I spent all my summers on my aunt's farm and was always happiest when I was in nature. But those couple years where I lived really unplugged from anything were very important years for me to get in touch with that voice inside of me, that thread of magic and of that really has led me on my journey. and also to really tune into, on a visceral level, the way that we are affected by the cycles of the moon, by the cycles of the seasons. That was just really, really profound. I mean, when you don't have electric light in your home for that long, it very quickly becomes apparent how much, as a woman especially, you are affected by the light of the moon, all right, and by the seasons. And so that was a really powerful time in my life, and it just continued my fascination for learning about that, that then led into and kind of crossed over with my study of yoga and later Ayurveda. So I've really been teaching with that. That's one of the primary themes in my teaching work forever and ever, is really, I don't know how to not teach in alignment with seasonal wisdom, but it's something that I've wanted to do for a long time, is actually take people kind of on a journey through the entire wheel of the year. And it's something I had in my head of a book that I'm writing, and a program. I always wanted to be able to gather live with women every single month. But the reality is that's just very hard. It's really hard. And I've been blessed to have been part of moon circles at periods of times in my life, but I know how hard it is to keep them going. And certainly with my life, I travel all the time, so my schedule is always different. So finally it just came to me, and it was one of those things that this has to happen now. It kind of came in a flash of inspiration. I'm like, I know, we're going to do the wheel of the year, and we're going to do it based on the new moon, because the new moon has always been, for the longest time, really since my early years as a practitioner, something I've kind of woven into my practice. So I started as an Ashtanga practitioner, and there you have this built into the system, this kind of recognition of the full and the new moons and taking rest, and I loved that. And over time, when I moved away from Ashtanga, which is a set sequence of yoga, and started developing my own sequences, and lived, of course, in Tofino, in a small town where there was no teacher, and had to kind of decide for myself, what should I practice? I started working with the new moon cycle. So I would create new practices to do based on the new moon, and that new moon based on what was happening with the astrology at that time and what season we were in. And that's just been the way I've structured my practice forever, and didn't really think about it. And then started working with that with groups of students more, primarily with meditation, and then thought, oh, this would be really fun to just share the process more, and even to develop it a bit more for other people, and then invite people into the conversation. And as soon as I thought about doing that, I knew it was something I wanted to do with women. And so that's how I created this idea. So basically we'll go through the wheel of 13 moons, and each moon cycle will offer inspiration and teachings and wisdom and practices to help tune into what's happening at that time. So I'm excited about it. And same as you're doing, I'll be bringing other women in throughout the year to have conversations. So basically I want that, you as a participant and anyone who's participating will get like a newsletter from me once a month, and it's just packed full of inspiration, and they can pull from the basket as they like meditation and simple practices for yoga and stuff they can do in the kitchen, and listening to another inspirational woman speak about a certain topic, and there'll be storytelling, there'll be all kinds of stuff.
And I think as a woman, we have, we are, speaking to the Mother Earth, and we are feminine essence as long as the earth. So we're really connected to nature in a really natural way. And we have these cycles, our, what I like to call moon time, traditionally, not all of us have it in cycle with the new moon right now, but because of life and things like that. But traditionally, that's when, women would gather, especially was around the new moon. And so it's such a beautiful way another way that, if, for me too, I live amongst nature and I have a lot of quiet time, and it's easier for me to hear that voice, for those of us who live in really busy cities and we have lots of jobs, the moon is such a great way to be able to connect to that and have those times where you're able to listen and to be able to cycle up with that. And
that's it. And that's part of why I wanted to offer it, is I recognize that I've spent a large portion of my life in relationship with nature, and I'm very attuned to it. And I just want to support other people in tuning in that way too, because I think once you start to, it just becomes so, what's the word I'm looking for? it just makes sense on a gut level. And then that's where women start to tap into their own intuition and healing power by aligning with these cycles. And it is not something that they need to impose on themselves from the outside. It's really just about tuning into these changing currents, right? And the way that things flow. So that's a big part, is just helping people who it's not obvious to them to start to feel that and sense that.
Yeah. Beautiful. Well, I think, we're going to post all of Natalie's information on the website, and you'll have access to her through there. And she has a lot of other things that she offers besides the 13 Moon Sadhana. And if you're in the Sea to Sky corridor area, and if you feel like going overseas on retreats, she has a lot going on, especially now with, I think there's India and Greece and things that are becoming more regular.
Yeah.
And so definitely please check her out. I would love to end with either a quote or a resource or something, or even a mentor that you've had, or just anything inspirational that is working for you now or has worked really well for you in the past.
Oh my gosh, I have so many. It's so hard.
Everyone says
that. The hardest question, like, can you give it like one book, your favorite book? I'm like, are you kidding me? I have like
your bookshelf behind
you. Then the bookshelves that are like loaded with like my best books. So I'm like, but maybe I would share a poem.
Okay.
I think there's if there's like one particular poet who has always spoken to me, who I feel like has been a voice that has inspired since I was 15 years old. That's Rilke. So he was a German poet. He's now passed on. But I'll recite this one poem that I think is very beautiful, very powerful. And it speaks a lot, I think, to what I was talking about earlier, this idea that there is something that we can find often within ourselves. And again, some people may feel that it is something external, like a guide or a deity, or just a sense of connection to spirit. And I, for me, it's both. I think it's something that exists within us and outside of us that we can attune to. And so the language in the beginning that he will use, of course, is the name God, but you can replace that with anything that you want to. And certainly if you read more of his poetry, you'll see that his sense of what God is really the world, the natural world and the universe. So, okay. So those of you listening, I think that when you're listening to poetry, it's best just to sort of close your eyes. You might put your hands on your heart. I'll take a moment to collect myself and remember the words. So, in the words of Rainer Maria Rilke, God speaks to each of us as he makes us, then walks us silently out of the night. These are the words we dimly hear before we begin. You, called forth by your senses and sent out beyond your recall, go to the limits of your longing. Embody me. Flare up like a flame and make great shadows I can dance in. Let everything into you, beauty and terror. Just keep going, for no feeling is final. Don't let yourself lose me. Nearby is the country they call life. You will know it by its seriousness. Now, reach out for me. Give me your hand.
That is a good one. That's beautiful. Well,
I just remember that, then that's all good.
Yeah, that's great. And I think, it's poetry and quotes, and the reason why we ask that all the time, they sometimes can speak the words that we can't find ourselves, and really help us connect to that place within us. So
I definitely, poetry and story, I find just often can kind of catapult you into that place where you get something in a different way.
Well, I just want to thank you so much for agreeing to come on here, and we definitely will probably follow up with you because it's been such a great conversation, and I know we can dive deeper into certain aspects, and we look forward to seeing how this all unfolds for you with this new program.
Thank you, Kelsey. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, thanks a lot.